We sincerely want to thank you guys for coming out this morning. And I wanted to talk for just a quick second about why we created From Day One. It's been impossible to ignore recently that corporate news has come at us in an avalanche of headlines. And a lot of those headlines have been about scandals and mistakes. It's not just headlines, it's digital media, it's social media. Sometimes it seems like everyone suddenly has a voice and they're shouting. Of course, there's quite a bit of noise out there and trivial stuff, but something really notable is actually happening. Businesses are being held to a higher level of accountability. Nearly every day, issues of ethics in business, they finally seem to be breaking through into the public sphere. Things like transparency and privacy, issues of gender, ethnic, or socioeconomic diversity. In this environment, a mission statement just isn't enough. Not only does a company need to have values that they hold in common with their constituencies, which are their employees, their customers, and the community that they're in, but those values have to be baked into the core of the business, the product, the team. You have to mean it and you have to prove it. And if you don't, those audiences we're talking about will hold you accountable. Your customers are paying attention to how you treat your employees. And your employees are paying attention to how you do business. If they're not aligned with those values, they'll walk. We believe that these changes, this progress is real and that it's permanent. Diversity, inclusion, transparency, these aren't just sort of buzzwords or trends that bounce around in the media. These are requirements of a modern business practice. People used to sort of talk about internet companies. You'd have like a software-driven insurgent company, someone like, say, Amazon, right, with their way of doing business. And then there'd be everybody else. At this point in 2019, obviously, there's no such thing as a successful business that doesn't have a digital or internet strategy. There's no such thing. And also, there were purpose-driven companies that had quirky, different ways of doing things. You can think of like a Costco, Patagonia is a great example. And then these were outliers, and people would talk about how they were different, and there'd be everybody else. In 2019 and 2020 and going forward, there's really only one kind of business strategy that's going to work. That's the kind of business strategy that takes into account the relationship between that business and the society that it's in. So we founded From Day One to try to get a handle on what comes next. Now that all these ideas have everybody's attention, what can those of us that work in business, that have to get up this morning and do something, actually do about it? How can we consider those social and ethical issues in the business models from day one? So we've gathered together a remarkable group of people today that are passionate about these issues. They're in a position to actually make some change, and you're one of them. And that brings me to an important point. I mentioned a lot of the feelings and emotions that we sort of had when we were starting the company in the initial conversation. Some of those feelings were things like, confusion. Like, how do you even approach these issues? There's all these ideas bouncing around. What do you do? Another feeling that's really common is just sort of feeling like it's too much. Like, how do you actually make change? How can you do anything? It's hard to see real change occur in real time. But this probably should have been obvious when we started doing these conferences about a year and a half ago. The overwhelming feeling that we keep sharing as we travel across the country and host events like this is a feeling of community. These are definitely tough problems, but they're a lot easier when you're surrounded by people that, like you, are committed to making some positive change. So take a look to your left and to your right. Everyone around you is in a position now within an organization to make a change within that organization. And they're here to share in a discussion, and they're here to have a discussion with you. And that's a discussion that we're thrilled to be here to listen to. So welcome to From Day One. And thanks so much to our sponsors. Without them, this would be completely impossible. And also to note, there'll be some breakout sessions going on throughout the day. So this is the only session happening right now, but as we proceed, there's sessions in a couple different rooms. So definitely check your programs and decide which of them you'd like to attend. And again, thank you to our sponsors. They are Accelerist, BetterUp, ClassPass, Cornerstone, DiversityComm, M-Train, Execute to Win, Jet Dental, Junco, Lever, Oh My Green, One Medical, Seek Out, Syndio, the iCliff Leadership and Governance Center, Ultimate Software, Vault Platform, and Visible. And now, to introduce the first session of the day. Hollywood has taken a lot of heat lately for its obsession with superheroes, sequels, and special effects. People started asking, does the film industry care about real people and the struggles of those people? How does it, or can it, do anything for those of us who aren't supernatural or starring in an action movie? Participant media is among the groups looking to answer that question by telling human stories, stories like Dark Waters, a story about a lawyer who crosses over from representing corporations to challenging one of the biggest of them on behalf of communities stricken by long-term chemical pollution. Participant also produced An Inconvenient Truth, Roma, Green Book, Spotlight. They're all stories that are for and about ordinary people in powerful situations. We're very excited that Participant Media's Chief Impact Officer, Holly Gordon, she'll be chatting with our author and columnist, Joel Stein, in a conversation about how Hollywood makes a difference in the real world. Please welcome Joel Stein and Holly Gordon. Thanks, guys.
5, 4, 3, 2.
What is it that has brought this big family of strangers together?
I created Participant because I believed in the power of storytelling to inspire mass audiences to social change.
The name Participant stands for commitment, passion.
They transcend politics. They're stories about people, and they're stories about issues.
That feeling, that voice that often doesn't get heard.
I think when you see yourself up there on the screen, your story is reflected and you feel empowered by that.
Participants' work doesn't stop when a film is released. It goes well beyond the life of a film.
They really stand at the intersection of art and activism.
You can't understand the problems, the issues, the day-to-day realities of so many people without stories to help us get closer to those communities.
We always work hand in hand with impact partners whose on-the-ground commitment to these issues is already creating change in the world today.
Partnering with advocacy groups, NGOs, and community organizations, we use art to create a shift in public consciousness.
It's changing the hearts and minds of people who are looking for ways to act.
There is a moment when you have to choose whether to be silent or to stand up.
Now!
Good morning, everyone.
Hi. This is very mellow. Yeah. Just gonna ease into these chairs.
I know they're very
mid-century modern chairs.
But I can spin.
Well, thanks for having me here to interview you. This is exciting for me. I'm a fan of lots of your films. But I want to talk first about how you kind of got into this. You were a journalist.
I was a journalist.
Yes.
I'm understanding many of the people behind this conference were
Yes.
journalists too.
Yeah. A lot of us had worked at Time Magazine at some point. And you made this documentary, Girl Rising, which then turned into, which was about 9 women from 9 different countries. Girls.
Girls, yeah.
I've learned not to say girls.
That's okay.
From 9 different countries who each had incredible struggles.
Very ordinary and extraordinary girls, so yeah.
And then you turned that into an entire movement, an activist campaign.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you make that shift from journalist to activist, and what went on in your mind when you made that decision.
Good question.
Asking for personal reasons.
It actually came from the challenge that journalism was facing at the time in the sort of cosmic way, which was the late 2000s. And I always actually look to the O.J. Simpson trial as a major, which wasn't then, that was 10 years prior, but as a major moment in journalism. And for those of you who were not in journalism, you may not have been watching as closely as those of us who were. I was at ABC News at the time, working on World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. And my job, I was the assistant to the executive producer, and one of my tasks was to walk the halls of power on the 5th floor where all the executives at ABC had their offices and share the ratings. And in those days, like, our ratings were huge. America sat down at 6:30 and chose between Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather, or Peter Jennings. And the future was bright. And then then CNN sort of came around and everyone was kind of chuckling about this, like, all-day news, who's gonna watch that? And then the OJ trial happened, and guess what? Gavel-to-gavel coverage pulled all of these people to CNN, and they basically never came back. And that's a very short story. But what we then experienced with the birth of, first, that was the first sort of, and why does it matter? It matters because the news is supposed to deliver three things: information that's vital to you as a human being, that's important to you as a human being, and that's interesting to you as a human being. And that's how we used to stack the evening news with Peter Jennings: vital, important, interesting. And so if you're not getting vital information for the future of humanity, important information is nice to have, and interesting is like, you don't actually need it to survive. If that's not easy to find, we were all thinking, like, how is this all going to play out? So long story short, or long story long, CNN was the first shot across the bow. The second was the advent of the internet.
Wait, so the OJ thing made you think, oh, we're done with vital and we're done with important?
Well, the OJ thing meant that we were doing more, by the time I left ABC News, we were doing more Paris Hilton than we were Middle East peace process.
But it was the OJ thing that really made you realize that. That was the moment.
I think that's like hindsight's 2020. Like when you start to look at what the demographics were doing and what viewers were doing. But because the OJ thing, like, how many of you guys remember the OJ thing? And because so I use that as a really, it's an example that everyone understands. And then the next thing is, and it's actually where it happened when you start reading about the history of sort of the news media and sharing of information. And then the second big thing was the advent of the internet, right? And with the internet, it's really all about clickbait. It's really all about, like, you know, the 7 ways to make sure you get a date. Oh yeah, that's actually, well, you could argue that's vital. But so are sort of more sobering stories like what's happening in the world with climate. And so it turns out that with Girl Rising, back to the question you asked me, it turns out that when you educate adolescent girls, factors of development, population growth, poverty, GDP, health outcomes for both the girls themselves and the families that they then create, levels of literacy, corruption, all those things go up. Things that you would never imagine, like corruption, go down. So as more and more girls in communities are educated, so all of these leading indicators for development get better. So in the news world, that's a vital story. If I told you there's a silver bullet to cure cancer, you'd want to know about it. Well, it turns out there's this silver bullet around global development, and it's girls' education. And at the time, it was the end of the 2000s, that was not a ubiquitous story. How many of you now feel as though you knew that actually educating girls is important to progress in the developing world?
Mostly women.
Great. I'm glad. I hope that I was just a small contributor to that. There are now many, many people who know this and are working on it. But and that also has to do with, you know, visible women in power. I won't go into the whole thing. But as a journalist, the question of, okay, so there's this incredible intervention, and nobody's paying attention to the evening news anymore. You can't put something on the cover of Time or one evening news broadcast and have Congress take action, whereas in the old days you could. How do you elevate a story that has so much importance to the world? And so Girl Rising was actually a business challenge from that perspective to me. I was like, okay, how do we do this? How in this new model where what you get on Facebook and Twitter were very new. Facebook was 2 years old, Twitter was a year old. I knew as a journalist that if you made a movie, there'd be lots of stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. I knew it would probably take us 3 to 4 years to make. And I also knew there were other actors across sort of power systems that were also interested in educating girls. One of them happened to be Intel, so for this audience that's important, right? Intel had a business reason for wanting to educate, to wanting to sort of raise issues around girls' education. And so what we did with the campaign was, number one, we started to produce stories about the vision of the campaign. So we started to sort of produce stories about the importance of educating girls, like before we started making the movie. And then as we made the movie, we made more and more of these stories, and we distributed them across these new platforms, Facebook and Twitter. And our goal was to find our audience, to find what I called our girl superfans, and build audience in advance of the movie. And we also went to every single door I could think of to knock on to say, hey, we're doing this big project. It's probably not coming out for 2 or 3 years, but hey, Intel, hey, Google, hey, Brookings Institution, hey, Clinton Global Initiative, do you want to be part of this major moment when this beautiful feature film comes out? And have all of your employees and all of your nonprofit key partners, Room to Read, World Vision, CARE International, some of our partners on the project, they all had advocates for girls in their sort of ecosystems, and they weren't storytellers. So we basically created this whole ecosystem. I like to think of it as a patchwork quilt, or an electricity grid of people who shared our visions and values around girls' education, so that when this movie came out, it was like we flipped a switch. It was like this giant lever that we'd been layering all these wires in our electricity grid, and suddenly we went boom and turned on the power, and the film came out. And again, we used Facebook and Twitter to sort of seed a theatrical release, and then we made a partnership with CNN and CNN International, and Girl Rising ended up reaching, hundreds of millions of people around the world on CNN and CNN International, and sparking little Girl Rising movements. Like, there's a group that meets on a second-floor mall in Lahore, Pakistan, Girl Rising Pakistan, and there's a whole Girl Rising India movement, and we're in 48 countries now around the world.
And that's kind of what you do as Chief Impact Officer now, right? You find
Yes.
So Participant makes movies with social issue themes,
Yeah.
and then you take those movies and find partners and start campaigns. So first of all, I want to talk about Participant, and I assume they have a very clear set of values. And when you're hired there, how do they impart those to you so that they're very clear to all the employees?
Well, the truth is that our values are really baked into our movies. When you start to look at our slate of movies, what you see is courage. What you see is compassion. What you see is a desire to lift voices that otherwise weren't heard. You actually saw it in the reel, so we actually just went through. So we went through a change of leadership about 4 years ago now, with David Lindy coming in and taking over, and we've been in a sort of reimagining of the future of Participant. And so we actually just finished a values exercise. We've been working on it for 18 months, and one of my colleagues, Whitney, is in the audience. She was on there she is. I have to go, so find her later if you want to know more about Participant. But she was actually on the values team, working for 18 months. So the employees sat down and said, what are our values? And then we had sessions where we shared them out, and people reflected. So that's how we did it.
And once you come to what those values are, is there ever conflict that comes back to those values, like disagreements about? I would assume there's disagreements about how, as there is in the activism community now, about how much peace and how much you want to stick with norms versus how much you want to kind of be.
So a good question. I think you're asking me, when do you take a stand and when don't you, kind of thing, or is there a conflict for what we should be doing?
Or what kind of a stand do you take? Like how much,
Yeah, so Jeff Skoll, many of the things, there's right and wrong. There's it's taking a stand on a movie like Dark Waters, which is about how we're being poisoned by chemicals that manufacturers use to make lots of things that we like, including probably this carpet, but are poisoning us.
I don't love this carpet.
No. Easy to take a stand. But I think we can sometimes confuse politics and problem solving. And at Participant, we try to stay out of politics and lean into problem solving. So we think of ourselves as bridge builders, and that we're rooted in a higher ideal for a more sustainable world of peace and prosperity. And we go into challenging conversations. For example, we made a movie that you have started to watch called American Factory about the future of work. We have
the Obamas
were a part of it, right? Producers on it. We are making a movie about gerrymandering, right? Well, it turns out Democrats and Republicans both gerrymander. Republicans are doing it better than Democrats right now. But guess what? No matter who does it, it's bad for democracy. So we're doing something that feels partisan because most Democrats are like, gerrymandering's terrible.
Do you have Republicans at participant?
I don't ask.
That's no.
No, I don't think it's a no. I don't actually think it's a no.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think it's a no. In fact, I have been like, I wonder. But I actually was part of this thing called the Presidential Leadership Scholars, which was totally before I went to participant. And it was an organization that was started by President Bush. It was a fellowship program started by President Bush and President Clinton. And because they're friends, right? They're like famously friends. And they started it because they wanted to have leaders who were making change across the country from different sides of the aisle get to know each other as humans before their politics. And so I have more Republican friends today than I did when I worked at ABC News, for sure. And I have a much, I would like Republican participants wanted. I'll say it right now. So if we don't have a lot of them, let's have some more of them. But I don't ask about politics because I actually am much more interested in what your vision and values are for a prosperous
What I was
country.
asking before about values, once they're you do this thing for 18 months, you kind of establish your values, you make them very clear to the employees. Is there tension? I'm particularly thinking about younger employees who maybe want a more virulent kind of activism than just partnering with Intel.
Well, that happened before participant. But
wait, what do you mean?
The Intel was with Girl Rising.
With
so
Levi's.
We've had other partners.
Is that
it's no. I think that those folks keep us. I love those young voices who are like, wait, we need to be doing more. Or one of there are voices in our company that is, and they're the young people who are like, wait, we have to be thinking first about impacted communities. Like, it's all great when you're in the halls of power and you're having conversations in the halls of power, but we need to be going into communities where these challenges are, these folks are really solving challenges. And the good news is that totally fits with my theory of how you make change in the world, which is all change happens at the community level. Community leaders know best how to work within their own community. And so with a film like Dark Waters, we're going into community in North Carolina, in Vermont, and we identify community leaders. And our hope is that this like multi-million-dollar piece of film, which a community leader would never be able to make, but can use as a way to knit the community together, that's the opportunity.
And you come in I was surprised, you come in super early into the process. I would think they make a movie, then you work on disseminating the activism. But how early do you walk into this process?
Well, we often read the scripts before they're greenlit.
Wow.
And we give notes, and we actually make suggestions for organizations who understand better the experience of the characters that are being written about than, say, for example, if it's about a Muslim woman, I actually don't have that perspective. And so we partner with Storyline Partners, which is a consortium of organizations that come from community. So we add that value to the narrative development process, and then we sit in the greenlight meeting.
As far as the research that they'll be doing on the script.
Yes.
So you come in that early where you're like, hey, this script is great, but we might want to do a little more research on something.
You might want to talk to these folks about it.
Interesting.
Yes, and then we have NDAs, and then we get insights. And then we sit in the greenlight process, and then we really actually start working as early as we possibly can with what I like to say the person who holds the why. So if the movie itself is the what, it's the product we make, there's always a why baked in if it's a participant movie. Like, why make Dark Waters? Because PFAS, because forever chemicals are poisoning us.
So that's at the very beginning, the why.
We try to get there. It doesn't always happen that way. We try to get there as early as possible. Right now, I would say we get there about 6 months before it hits we know the why much earlier, but we start talking to the people who hold the why about 6 months
Okay,
before
so
the
like
movie comes out.
Roma was one of my favorite movies of the last few years.
Alfonso held that why, the director, you saw him on.
So that's what I was wondering, because like I watched that movie, and maybe it's because I'm an old white guy, I was like, oh, if there was a why to this, it's about authoritarianism and I asked my wife yesterday if she had the same thing. She's like, no, it's about domestic workers. And
I love his wife already.
I do too. But the why could have been several things in that movie.
Yes, and often it can be. And so it's really important to talk to the person who holds the why about why they made the movie, because the why is the thing that's like the fabric of the film. And the reason the why was domestic workers is that actually in making this movie, which I think Alfonso originally made, because that was a very tumultuous time both in his family, like as a storyteller he was interested in the tumult in the family that's reflected in the tumult in his country that he loves, right? And actually in the filmmaking process he discovered all of the tumult that was happening with Cleo. Lebo is her real name, and the nanny that helped to raise him. Right. And so in doing the research on the movie, he found out that Lebo had this whole thing happen to her, and he was a little boy in the movie. He had no idea.
So that wasn't his original intention when he made the movie.
No,
it was
he
a
made
story
the
about
movie
his
because he was telling a wonderful story, and that's what artists do.
Yeah.
They tell stories, and usually, you know, I like to say that artists can see around corners because artists see things before the rest of us do, and so they tell stories, and it's in their stories that we find wisdom because they're sensing people.
So in the original script, the why wasn't as clear.
We knew that it was about women.
You did,
For me, that movie was all about women, right? The mom's holding the bag, the Cleo's holding the bag, like the men go away and the women are left holding the bag to keep everything together. And so we originally came to Alfonso and said, you know, it's about women in Mexico, and he's like, no, it's actually about domestic. I want to focus the work on Cleo. And I'll just quickly tell you that last week we have continued to campaign Roma in Mexico because Roma has had such an enormous impact on the narrative across Mexico. So the first thing that happened was when the movie came out on Netflix in December, the Social Security, the Supreme Court of Mexico for the first time mandated that domestic workers had access to Social Security benefits. When it won the Oscar, the next day the president said, okay, we're going to fast track protections for domestic workers in Mexico. They had a special session of their legislative body in June and passed that law. But what it was employers had to register that they have these domestic workers. So anyone who works in marketing in this room knows that there's a difference between making, or even any kind of employee, communication. There's a difference between making a policy and making sure everybody knows about the policy. So they made the policy, but how are workers to know about the policy? Well, we partnered with Wyden and Kennedy, who had done our brand work for Participant, and they said, hey, we'll help make a PSA to do this. And so last week the PSA launched in Mexico. It's being seen on every public television channel and across radio programs. And the president of Mexico to drive enrollment, and the president of Mexico yesterday, last week, committed to the one last piece of legislation that hadn't been passed, and it's a UN legislation from the International Labor Organization around treatment of domestic workers across Mexico. So they are now signatories to this piece of legislation that the domestic workers have been trying to get passed for 10 years. So that's the power of a major piece of content like Roma. The dollars behind the visibility of that film, the award, and a director like Alfonso, who's behind us the whole way.
Besides the director, do you step in on the casting part? So how do you make sure you've cast actors who are going to care, who are going to get out there for you, or is that just luck?
No, those are the actors that raise their hand and say, I want to be in this movie.
Oh, you think that's a self-selecting process?
I do.
Even if it's just a great script and it's like a cool role?
I think it's a great script, but people who are attracted to great scripts, there are these kinds of great scripts. I mean, it's not always the case, but, Mark Ruffalo is a great example.
He really
lives
stepped up,
right?
Yeah.
Armie Hammer was in On the Basis of Sex, and if you look at Armie Hammer's choices, I see someone who's taking risky roles that are all about equity. But I don't know. I've never talked to Armie about it.
But do you need those people out there on the front lines?
Oh my gosh, we love it.
Okay,
we love it. Ava DuVernay. Talk about someone who lives their why with When They See Us, right? About Central Park 5, her Netflix series from this spring. She's someone who is living her why every time she makes a piece of content. Amazing.
And we only have 4 minutes left. I was going to take 1 or 2 questions from the people sitting here staring at me. Not me, you.
I could just do a quick,
Go ahead.
Well, as you guys think about your work, think about how we partner with folks like you all the time on our content. And the reason that I came to this was to say, like, we are open for this kind of partnership because when you look at the kind of change we need to make in the world, we are an ecosystem. It is a system we need to change. And if you're in this room to the point of opening of the opening remarks, you're in a position where you can live your why through the work that you do, and if we can help you with the stories we tell and partner with you around the stories we tell, that's exciting for us.
And how do you search for those partners? I know the partners aren't always obvious to me when I look at who you work with on a film.
No, so we look at the people who are already making change in the space that the partners that the campaign is about. It's easier when you're doing something like On the Basis of Sex and you're talking about gender equity. Every company in the world has understood that gender equity is a key
so how does Bank of America get involved in that?
So Bank of America did 19 screenings of On the Basis of Sex where we call them private screening experiences. We provide customizable invites and talking points and run
Popcorn?
a show and suggest it. No, they got to pay for their own popcorn.
All right.
But Bank of America used it as a way to showcase their efforts internally, but also in communities across the country and galvanize their employees and reinforce the values of gender equity within the company and in the community. And to me, that's like a total win-win.
Bigger win if there's popcorn.
Yeah, much better.
Are there any questions in the 2 minutes that we have left?
Who's going to be the first?
Oh.
So super powerful. This is Anup from Seek Out. Stories and the power of the stories. What we are seeing today is the opposite side too, where the power of stories can be used to communicate and disinform people.
Yeah.
So I am curious about your take on how one overcomes that or how one may respond to that.
That is a great question. So I think more people are good than are evil. I think, I'm going to put my own number out there. I think 97% of the world's population is good and 3% is evil. But those 3% are super motivated. And what I said we had an offsite with my, it's true, the rest of us are like busy doing our jobs, raising our families, going to church. They're like, oh my God, we're going to kill. So my big insight of the last 10 years is that ISIS is doing a really good job, or they were doing a really good job putting the world's greatest superpower on its back feet, and it's like in proportion like 20 people. And how do they do it? Stories, galvanizing values, a perspective on the world. So what I just on Friday said to my team, if ISIS and the Russians can use stories to divide us, I want to be 100 times better, 100 times more powerful than them to use stories to unite us.
All right, tell better stories than ISIS is your takeaway.
And partner with the 97% who are good. And look, we got a whole consortium in here. So,
thank you so much for coming. It was so
Joel.
nice talking to you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, guys.